Professor Zixtala stood at the front of the xenobiology classroom, her crystalline body catching the artificial light and splitting it into rainbow patterns across the walls. She was 12 feet tall and looked like a living sculpture made of clear blue crystal, with energy pulses flowing through her translucent form like liquid starlight. Her voice resonated through the room with a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. The classroom held 23 students from 13 different species, all part of the Galactic Educational Exchange Program. Each species had earned their place through academic excellence, representing the best and brightest minds from across the galaxy. The Threnody students could phase through solid matter at will, their ghostly forms shimmering between dimensions. The Kelpians sat in specialized water tanks, their gills filtering oxygen from the liquid while their tentacles took notes on waterproof tablets. The Volcari students glowed with internal heat, their rock-like skin proof against temperatures that would melt steel. In the back row sat Kevin Martinez, the only human in the class. He was average height with brown hair and dark eyes, wearing the standard blue uniform of Earth's Colonial Academy. While his classmates displayed obvious supernatural abilities, Kevin looked remarkably ordinary. He had no claws, no natural armor, no energy weapons growing from his body. The other students often wondered why humans had been included in the exchange program at all. Professor Zixtala activated the holographic display, showing a planet that looked like a vision of hell. The world was covered in bubbling swamps of acid, with toxic gas clouds drifting between twisted metal trees. The very air shimmered with corrosive particles that would eat through most materials in seconds. Purple lightning crackled through the poisonous atmosphere, and the ground itself seemed to steam with dangerous chemicals. "Students, behold Korath Prime," Professor Zixtala announced, her voice carrying notes of both pride and menace. "This world represents the ultimate test of biological adaptation. The atmosphere contains 17 different types of acid. The water can dissolve titanium in under 4 minutes, and the native life forms have evolved to be among the most aggressive in the galaxy." Kevin raised his hand slowly. "Professor, that looks extremely dangerous. Are we going to study it from the safety of the ship?" A sound like breaking glass filled the room as Professor Zixtala laughed. "Oh, dear human, you misunderstand completely. We will not be studying Korath Prime from a safe distance. You will be experiencing it firsthand." The alien students around Kevin began to murmur excitedly. The Threnody student named Lisa flickered between solid and ghost form, clearly eager to test her phasing abilities. Jake, the Kelpian, flexed his tentacles and gurgled something that sounded like enthusiasm. Amy, the Volcari, actually began to glow brighter with anticipation. "This is a survival exercise," Professor Zixtala continued, her crystalline form pulsing with energy. "Each species will demonstrate their natural adaptations by surviving on Korath Prime for exactly 72 hours. The Threnody can phase through the acid, the Kelpians can filter toxins through their biological systems, and the Volcari are immune to the corrosive effects of the atmosphere." Kevin felt his stomach drop. "What about humans? We don't have any special abilities like that?" Professor Zixtala's attention focused on him like a laser beam. "Humans are merely another species, Kevin Martinez. Surely you have some natural survival mechanism that your people evolved over millions of years. Perhaps you can grow protective skin, or maybe you can hibernate through danger." "No, Professor," Kevin said quietly. "Humans are just humans. We don't have any special powers." The classroom fell silent. Several alien students turned to stare at Kevin with expressions that ranged from confusion to pity. How could a species survive without natural weapons or defensive abilities? It seemed impossible to most of them. "Nonsense," Professor Zixtala declared. "Every species has evolved specialized traits for survival. You simply haven't discovered yours yet. This exercise will reveal what humans are truly capable of when faced with mortal danger." She waved her hand, and the holographic display changed to show equipment and supplies. Each student will be provided with basic protective gear that will last approximately 15 minutes in Korath Prime's environment. After that, you must rely on your natural abilities and whatever materials you can find on the planet itself. Kevin looked around the room desperately. Professor, I really don't think humans have any special survival abilities. Maybe I should sit this one out? Absolutely not, Professor Zixthala replied, her voice like ice crystals forming. This exercise is designed to push each species to their limits. Only by facing true danger can we discover what we are truly capable of achieving. The other students began chattering excitedly about the challenge ahead. Lisa the Threnody was already practicing her phasing, disappearing and reappearing in her seat. Jake the Kelpian was testing his filtration systems, processing the classroom air through his gills. Amy the Valkyrie was heating up, her rocky skin glowing like coals in a fireplace. Kevin felt completely out of place, while his classmates prepared to use abilities that seemed like magic to him. He had nothing but his basic human brain and two ordinary hands. He had studied hard to earn his place in this advanced class, but now he wondered if Earth's education system had made a terrible mistake by sending him here. The transport will begin in 1 hour, Professor Zixthala announced. Use this time to prepare yourselves mentally and physically. Remember, this is not just a test of survival, but a demonstration of your species' evolutionary superiority. As the other students filed out of the classroom, discussing their strategies and showing off their abilities, Kevin remained in his seat. He stared at the holographic image of Korath Prime, trying to imagine how he could possibly survive on a world that seemed designed to kill anything that touched it. Professor Zixthala noticed him sitting alone. Kevin Martinez, you seem concerned about this exercise. I am concerned, Professor, Kevin replied honestly. I don't want to die on an alien planet because I'm not evolved enough. Death is always a possibility in true scientific exploration, Professor Zixthala said, her crystalline form flickering with what might have been amusement. But I suspect you will surprise yourself. Every species has hidden depths that only emerge under extreme pressure. Kevin nodded, though he felt no confidence in her words. As he gathered his books and prepared to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to become the first human to fail spectacularly in front of the entire galaxy. The transport beam deposited all 23 students into the acidic swamp with a flash of blue light. Kevin hit the soggy ground hard, his protective suit already beginning to smoke from contact with the corrosive air. Around him, his classmates materialized in various states of panic and confusion. The smell hit him first, a combination of sulfur, rotting metal, and something that reminded him of burning plastic. The air itself seemed thick and oily, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Despite the filtration mask, through the yellow-tinted visor of his protective helmet, Kevin could see the nightmare landscape stretching in all directions. Pools of bubbling acid dotted the swamp like deadly lakes, each one a different color depending on its chemical composition. Some glowed green with radiation, others burned orange with heat, and a few sparkled with metallic particles that dissolved anything they touched. Between the pools, twisted trees made of some kind of metal grew from the poisonous soil, their branches dripping with condensed acid that sizzled when it hit the ground. Lisa the Threnody immediately tried to phase through the dangerous environment, but her ghostly form began to scream as the acidic air burned her even in her shifted state. She flickered back to solid form, clutching her throat and gasping for breath. Her natural ability, which had always protected her before, was useless against an atmosphere that could hurt her in any dimension. Jake the Kelpian activated his biological filtration system, drawing the toxic air through his gills to clean it, before it reached his lungs. For a moment it seemed to work, but then he began coughing violently as the acid overwhelmed his natural defenses. His tentacles turned pale and started to curl up in pain as the corrosive chemicals ate through his protective slime coating. Amy the Valkyrie had the best luck initially, her rock-like skin providing some protection against the acidic air. But even her natural armor began to smoke and crack as the concentrated chemicals found weak points in her biological defenses. She pressed her hands against the largest cracks, trying to seal them, but more appeared faster than she could repair them. All around Kevin, His classmates were discovering that their evolutionary advantages were not enough for this extreme environment. The Zephyrians, who could control wind, found that moving the toxic air only spread the danger. The crystallines, whose bodies were made of living mineral, watched in horror as the acid began dissolving their crystalline flesh. The nebulans, who could absorb energy, discovered that the planet's radiation was too intense for their systems. To process safely, Kevin looked down at his own protective suit and saw that it was already developing holes where the acid had eaten through the fabric. His gloves were smoking and his boots were beginning to dissolve at the solace. He had maybe 10 minutes before his protection failed completely, and then he would be exposed to an environment that was already killing his naturally adapted classmates. Panic began to spread through the group as students realized their situation was far worse than Professor Zixtella had implied. Several aliens were already showing signs of serious injury, their natural defenses failing against the planet's extreme conditions. The exercise was supposed to test their abilities, but it was becoming clear that even evolved biological advantages had limits. Kevin forced himself to stay calm and think logically. While his classmates focused on their failing biological systems, he began to observe the environment more carefully. The human approach had always been to understand a problem before trying to solve it, and this situation called for analysis rather than panic. He noticed that not everything in the swamp was being destroyed by the acid. The twisted metal trees were obviously adapted to the environment, but there was something else that caught his attention. Scattered throughout the swamp were enormous mushrooms, some as tall as buildings, growing directly from the acidic soil. Their caps were easily 20 feet across, and their stems were thick enough to hollow out into shelters. What fascinated Kevin was that these mushrooms appeared to be thriving in the deadly environment. While everything else was being dissolved or burned, the fungi seemed completely unaffected by the corrosive atmosphere. In fact, they looked healthy and vibrant, their surfaces gleaming with what looked like natural moisture rather than acid damage. Kevin approached one of the smaller mushrooms carefully, watching as drops of acid rain fell onto its surface. Instead of burning through the fungal tissue, the acid seemed to slide off harmlessly, leaving the mushroom completely undamaged. He knelt down and examined the base of the stem, noting how it grew directly from soil that would have dissolved his boots in seconds. The other students were too busy dealing with their own failing defenses to notice Kevin's investigation. Lisa was flickering between dimensions frantically, trying to find a phase state that would protect her from the burning air. Jake had curled up into a defensive ball, his tentacles wrapped around his body to minimize exposure. Amy was using her heat powers to try to seal the cracks in her skin, but she was fighting a losing battle against the relentless acid. Kevin realized that he was looking at the solution to their problem, but it required a completely different approach than what his classmates were attempting. Instead of trying to fight the environment with biological advantages, he needed to work with it using the tools and materials that were already present. He carefully removed one of his gloves, knowing that his protection was failing anyway. The acid air immediately began to sting his exposed skin, but he ignored the pain and touched the mushroom stem gently. The surface felt smooth and slightly waxy, with a texture that seemed to repel liquid. When he pulled his hand away, his skin was unmarked despite direct contact with a surface that should have been covered in acid. Kevin's mind began to race with possibilities. The mushrooms had evolved the perfect solution to survival on Korath. Prime and humans had always been excellent at learning from nature. If he could understand how these fungi protected themselves, maybe he could find a way to protect his classmates and himself. Around him, the other students continued to struggle with their failing biological adaptations, but Kevin had found something they had all missed. The key to surviving this deadly world was not to fight it with superior evolution, but to learn from the life forms that had already mastered the challenge. He just had to figure out how to turn that knowledge into a solution before his protective suit dissolved completely and left him as vulnerable as the rest of them. Kevin watched his protective suit continue to dissolve while his classmates struggled with their failing biological defenses. The acid was eating through the fabric faster now, and he could feel the burning sensation on his skin wherever the chemicals touched him. He had perhaps 5 minutes before his protection failed completely, but instead of panicking like the others, he focused on the mushrooms that surrounded them. He moved carefully toward the largest mushroom cluster, studying how the fungi interacted with the hostile environment. The mushrooms seemed to have multiple layers of protection, with their outer surfaces coated in a waxy substance that caused the acid to bead up and roll off like water on a duck's back. The stems were hollow, he realized, which explained why they could grow so large without being dissolved from the inside. Kevin knelt beside one of the smaller mushrooms and examined its base more closely. The root system was extensive, spreading through the acidic soil like a natural filtration network. The roots were not being damaged by the corrosive chemicals, which meant they had evolved some kind of neutralizing mechanism. This was exactly what they needed to survive. Behind him, Jake the Kelpian was making choking sounds as his natural filtration system failed completely. His tentacles were turning white and beginning to curl up in pain. Amy the Volcari was trying to help him, but her own rocky skin was cracking and smoking from the acid exposure. Lisa the Threnody kept flickering between dimensions, but each time she solidified, she screamed from the burning air. Kevin knew he had to act fast. He pulled out his emergency knife, one of the few tools they had been allowed to bring, and carefully cut into the mushroom stem. The blade sliced through the fungal tissue easily, revealing the hollow interior he had suspected. The walls of the stem were thick and spongy, with a texture that reminded him of cork or foam insulation. When he examined the cut surface, Kevin discovered something remarkable. The mushroom tissue was not just resistant to acid, it actually seemed to neutralize it on contact. Where drops of acid rain hit the exposed interior, they fizzed and bubbled before becoming harmless water. The fungi had evolved a biological mechanism that could convert the deadly chemicals into safe substances. Kevin began cutting larger sections of the mushroom stem, working as quickly as he could while his protective suit continued to disintegrate. The fungal material was surprisingly easy to work with, bending and shaping without breaking. He realized that the mushrooms had evolved to be flexible as well as acid-resistant, probably to survive the violent storms that swept across the planet. He started weaving strips of the mushroom material together, creating a mat that could serve as a foundation for a shelter. The process was similar to basket weaving, something his grandmother had taught him as a child. The human ability to learn and adapt skills from one situation to another was proving invaluable in this deadly environment. As Kevin worked, he noticed that the mushroom secretions were coating his hands and arms where his protective suit had dissolved. Instead of burning his skin, the natural fungal coating seemed to protect him from the acid. He realized that the mushrooms produced their own protective substances that could be harvested and used. Jake, the Kelpian, had collapsed nearby, his tentacles completely white and unresponsive. Kevin abandoned his weaving and crawled over to his classmate, carrying a large piece of freshly cut mushroom cap. He placed the fungal material over Jake's body like a blanket, hoping that the acid-neutralizing properties would give the alien student some relief. The effect was immediate. Jake's tentacles began to regain their color as the mushroom material absorbed and neutralized the acid that had been burning him. His gills started working properly again, filtering the air through the protective fungal barrier. Kevin had discovered that the mushrooms could not only protect him, but could also shield his classmates from the deadly environment. Amy the Volcari saw what Kevin was doing and crawled over to help. Her rocky skin was cracked and smoking, but she was still functional enough to assist. Together, they began cutting larger pieces of mushroom material and distributing them to the other struggling students. Each piece of fungal tissue provided immediate relief from the burning acid. Kevin realized that he needed to think bigger. Individual pieces of mushroom material could provide temporary protection, but they needed a permanent shelter that could keep them safe for the full 72 hours. He began studying the structure of the mushrooms more carefully, looking for ways to use their natural architecture as a foundation for a larger construction. The mushroom stems were naturally hollow and waterproof, which meant they could be used as building materials for a floating platform. The caps were broad and flat, perfect for creating a roof that would shed acid rain. The root systems were extensive and buoyant, which would help keep any structure afloat on the acidic swamp water. Kevin began connecting multiple mushroom stems together using the natural secretions from the caps as a biological adhesive. The process was slow and careful, but each connection created a stronger and more stable structure. He was essentially building a raft from living materials that were perfectly adapted to the hostile environment. Lisa the Threnody had stopped flickering between dimensions and was watching Kevin work with fascination. Her ghostly abilities had failed her completely, but she was beginning to understand that the human was approaching the problem from an entirely different angle. Instead of relying on evolved biological advantages, Kevin was using intelligence and creativity to engineer a solution. As Kevin continued building his mushroom platform, other students began to gather around him. They were all suffering from the effects of the acid, but Kevin's protective fungal materials were giving them enough relief to function. They started helping with the construction, following Kevin's instructions even though they did not fully understand his plan. The platform was taking shape rapidly. Kevin had connected dozens of mushroom stems to create a flexible foundation that could float on the acidic water. The structure was naturally waterproof and acid-resistant, with built-in drainage systems that would channel dangerous liquids away from the living space. He had created the beginnings of a shelter that could not only survive on Korath Prime, but actually thrive in its deadly environment. Kevin looked around at his classmates, who were all watching him with expressions of amazement and hope. They had come to this planet expecting to demonstrate their evolutionary superiority, but instead they were learning about the power of human ingenuity and adaptation. The real test was just beginning. Kevin's mushroom platform had grown from a simple raft into something much more impressive. Word of his success was spreading among the surviving students, and more aliens were making their way to his floating shelter. The platform now measured nearly 30 feet across and could support the weight of multiple students while remaining stable on the bubbling acid water. Jake the Calpian had recovered enough to be helpful, and his natural abilities were proving valuable in unexpected ways. His tentacles could sense chemical differences in the mushroom varieties, helping Kevin identify which fungi were safe to harvest and which ones might be dangerous. Jake discovered that the blue-capped mushrooms had stronger acid-neutralizing properties, while the red-capped ones were better for structural support. Amy the Volcari was using her heat resistance to solve problems that Kevin could not handle alone. Some of the mushroom materials needed to be heated to become flexible enough for construction, and Amy's natural warmth was perfect for this task. She could soften the fungal fibers without damaging them, making them easier to weave into protective clothing and shelter walls. Lisa the Threnody had found a completely new use for her phasing abilities. While she could not phase through the acidic air safely, she could briefly shift into her ghostly form to reach mushroom materials that were growing in dangerous locations. She would phase just long enough to grab what they needed, then return to solid form before the acid could burn her shifted state. Kevin was amazed at how quickly his classmates were adapting to work with the mushroom materials. Each species brought their own unique abilities to the construction project, and Kevin was learning to coordinate their efforts like a human project manager. The shelter was becoming a collaborative effort that combined the best of human engineering. With alien capabilities, the platform had expanded to include separate living areas for different species. Kevin had designed sleeping spaces that could be sealed against acid rain, work areas where students could process mushroom materials, and even a central gathering space where they could plan their next improvements. The entire structure floated peacefully on the acidic water, rising and falling gently with the chemical tides. Kevin had also solved the problem of food and water. The mushrooms themselves were edible after proper processing, and their natural filtration systems could purify even the most contaminated water. He showed his classmates how to create simple tools from hardened mushroom stems, how to weave protective clothing from fungal fibers, and how to build water collectors that would gather and purify the acid rain more students were arriving at the shelter throughout the day. A group of Zephyrians had managed to fly to the platform despite their damaged wings, and they were now helping to create air circulation systems using hollow mushroom tubes. The crystallines, whose bodies were slowly regenerating from the acid damage, were contributing their knowledge of structural engineering to make the platform more stable. Kevin realized that he was no longer just building a survival shelter, but creating a small community. Each new arrival brought fresh ideas and abilities that improved their situation. The human talent for organization and leadership was proving as valuable as his engineering skills, and the alien students were responding well to his collaborative approach. The shelter was becoming increasingly sophisticated as more students contributed their expertise. The Nebulans had figured out how to use the mushroom materials to create a power generation system, converting the planet's dangerous radiation into usable energy. The Aquarians had designed a water recycling system that could process unlimited amounts of contaminated liquid into clean drinking water. Kevin watched his classmates work together with growing satisfaction. They had started the exercise as individual students trying to prove their species' superiority, but now they were functioning as a unified team. The human approach of cooperation and shared knowledge was transforming the group into something more effective than any individual could achieve alone. As evening approached, the shelter had grown into a small floating village. Kevin had organized the students into work teams that rotated through different tasks, ensuring that everyone contributed to the community while also getting adequate rest. The platform now included workshops, storage areas, sleeping quarters, and even a small garden where they were experimenting with growing mushrooms in controlled conditions. Professor Zixtela was monitoring the exercise from her ship in orbit, and her instruments were showing readings that confused her. The human students' bioshelter was not just surviving the deadly environment, but actually thriving in it. The platform showed signs of sustainable growth, with new sections being added regularly and resource production increasing rather than decreasing. Kevin had established a communication system using reflective mushroom caps that could send light signals to other parts of the swamp. They had made contact with 3 other small groups of students who were struggling to survive, and Kevin was already planning rescue missions to bring them to the safety of the floating village. The most impressive development was the way Kevin had transformed the group dynamics. Instead of competing with each other to prove species superiority, the students were now working together to solve problems and improve their shared living conditions. The human concept of teamwork was proving more effective than individual biological advantages. As night fell over the acidic swamp, Kevin stood at the edge of the platform and looked out over their growing community. The shelter was now home to 18 students from 11 different species, all working together under human leadership. They had not just survived the first day of the exercise, but had created something that could support them indefinitely. The floating village was lit by bioluminescent mushrooms that glowed softly in the toxic darkness. The air circulation system was working perfectly, providing clean breathing space for all the different species. The water purification system was producing more clean water than they could use, and the food production was exceeding their consumption. Kevin realized that they had accomplished something remarkable. They had taken the most hostile environment any of them had ever encountered and turned it into a thriving community. The human ability to adapt and innovate had not only saved their lives, but had created a model for how different species could work together to overcome any challenge. The floating mushroom village was proof that human ingenuity, combined with alien abilities and cooperative effort, could triumph over even the most impossible odds. Kevin smiled as he watched his classmates settling in for the night, knowing that they had already succeeded beyond anything Professor Zixtela had expected from this exercise. The 72-hour exercise was scheduled to end at exactly noon on the 3rd day, and Professor Zixtela prepared to transport down to the swamp surface to collect whatever students had managed to survive. Her crystalline form pulsed with anticipation as she reviewed the monitoring data from her ship's sensors. The readings were unlike anything she had seen in decades of conducting these survival exercises. Most of the biosignatures were concentrated in a single location, which suggested that the surviving students had gathered together for mutual protection. This was typical behavior for species facing extinction-level threats, but the energy readings from that location were completely unexpected. Instead of the declining vital signs she usually detected from struggling survivors, the sensors showed increasing activity and what appeared to be sustainable resource production. Professor Zixtela materialized on the surface of Korath Prime, expecting to find a handful of exhausted students huddled together in makeshift shelters. Instead, she found herself standing at the edge of a thriving floating city that stretched across nearly half an acre of acidic swamp water. The structure was built entirely from the native mushroom materials, but it had been engineered with a sophistication that impressed even her advanced alien intellect. The floating village was organized into distinct districts connected by covered walkways that protected the inhabitants from acid rain. There were residential areas where students could rest safely, workshops where they processed raw materials, storage facilities for food and supplies, and even recreational spaces where different species could socialize during their off-duty hours. The entire structure rose and fell gently with the chemical tides, perfectly adapted to the hostile environment. Kevin Martinez stood at the center of the village, directing the daily activities with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for years rather than days. He was wearing clothing woven from mushroom fibers that looked more comfortable and protective than the original survival suits they had been issued. His skin was healthy and unmarked by acid damage, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had not just survived but mastered his environment. Around Kevin, 22 other students from 12 different species were going about their daily routines. They were all healthy, well-fed, and working together with a level of cooperation that Professor Zixtela had never seen before in her mixed-species classes. The Threnody students were using their phasing abilities to maintain the structural integrity of the floating platform. The Kelpians were operating the water purification systems with their natural filtration knowledge. The Volcari were managing the heating and energy systems that kept the community comfortable. Professor Zixtela walked through the village in growing amazement. Every system was not only functional but optimized for efficiency and sustainability. The mushroom farms were producing more food than the community could consume, with the excess being processed and stored for future use. The water recycling systems were so effective that they were actually improving the quality of the swamp water around the platform. The air filtration systems were creating a clean, breathing environment for all species simultaneously. The most remarkable discovery was that the students had not just survived the 72-hour test, but had created a permanent settlement that could support long-term habitation. The village showed signs of planned expansion, with new sections under construction and resource production systems being scaled up to support a larger population. They had transformed a survival exercise into a colonization project. Kevin noticed Professor Zixtela's arrival and approached her with a respectful but confident demeanor. "Good morning, Professor. I hope you're satisfied with our progress during the exercise." Professor Zixtela's crystalline form flickered with confusion and something that might have been embarrassment. "Kevin Martinez, I must confess that your performance has exceeded my expectations in ways I did not think possible. When I designed this exercise, I expected to find struggling survivors, not a thriving community." "Thank you, Professor," Kevin replied simply. "We learned a lot about working together during the past 3 days." Professor Zixtela examined the mushroom structures more closely, her scientific mind trying to understand how such sophisticated engineering had been achieved with primitive materials. "How did you accomplish this? Your species has no natural acid resistance, no biological filtration systems, no evolutionary advantages that should have helped you survive in this environment." Kevin smiled and gestured toward his classmates, who had gathered around to listen to the conversation. "You're right, Professor. Humans don't have special biological abilities like the other species. But we do have something else that turned out to be even more useful. What could possibly be more valuable than evolutionary adaptation?" Professor Zixtala asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity. The ability to learn from our environment. And work together to solve problems, Kevin explained. Instead of trying to fight the acid with our bodies, we studied the mushrooms that had already solved the problem. Instead of competing with each other to prove who was strongest, we combined our different abilities to build something better than any of us could create alone. Professor Zixtala looked around the village again, seeing it now from a completely different perspective. The human had not just survived by copying the mushroom's natural defenses, but had improved upon them through engineering and organization. The floating city was more advanced than anything the native life forms had evolved, created through intelligence and cooperation rather than biological adaptation. This changes everything I thought I knew about species survival, Professor Zixtala admitted. I assumed that biological advantages were the key to overcoming environmental challenges. But you have demonstrated that intelligence and social cooperation can be far more powerful, Kevin nodded thoughtfully. Each species has evolved amazing abilities, Professor, but humans evolved the ability to help other species use their abilities better. That's what made this village possible. Professor Zixtala realized that she had been fundamentally wrong about the nature of evolutionary advantage. While other species had developed specialized biological tools, humans had developed the ability to create and use any tool that a situation required. Their adaptability came not from their bodies, but from their minds, and their capacity for cooperation. The floating mushroom village would become famous throughout the galaxy as a case study in human engineering and leadership. The survival exercise had revealed that humanity's greatest strength was not any single ability, but their talent for bringing out the best in others and creating solutions that no one had imagined possible. As the transport beam began to gather the students for return to their ship, Professor Zixtala took one last look at the thriving village. The acid swamps of Korath Prime, once considered uninhabitable, now hosted a permanent research station built on Kevin's original design. The human had not just passed the test, but had redefined what it meant to be evolutionarily superior. Kevin Martinez returned to Earth as a hero, but he remained humble about his achievement. To him, he had simply done what humans do best, looked at an impossible problem and found a way to make it work.